Have you ever been caught in Atlanta traffic during rush hour? A lot of times I'd have to fly for work, and when I would come back, it would be on Friday evening. And I would arrive at the airport around 5:30, right in the heart of the rush hour. And I remember on one specific occasion getting in the car, trying to get back to Rome, and not moving an inch, surrounded by cars in 5 lanes that did not move. And I was thinking, how many people are in Atlanta? Well, of course, there are millions. How many people are driving at this time? Every one of them. But as we sat there in standstill traffic, I looked around and I said, this is a crowd of people. We're in our little cocoons, what we call cars, and yet we're totally isolated from each other, even though we're part of the crowd. And I began to wonder what's going on in that person's life or that person's life. Are they trying to get home like me? Have they just flown in? Are they just coming home from work somewhere in Atlanta? Are they just starting to make a weekend's trip? You wonder about those things. But it was interesting that I felt that even though I was one among many, I felt totally alone, separated from them. And sometimes when I think of social media, and I talked with Ron about this yesterday, never have we been so connected and yet so isolated from each other. In Luke 8, verse 19, as this was read earlier, Jesus' family, his mother and brothers, come to see him. But by this time, Jesus had grown in fame. The stories of what he had done, the miracles that he performed had spread. And so now people were flocking to him. So wherever Jesus was, people came to him and the word would spread and more people would come. And in this particular case, as Mary and her sons tried to get near Jesus, the verse simply states that they could not approach him because of the crowd. They were simply lost in the crowd among all the people. And I say today we can also find ourselves lost in the crowd. However, we need to realize that we do not have to stay lost in the crowd. The Bible contains many examples of people who were lost in the crowd only to be discovered by the Lord. And we're going to look at a few of those individuals this morning that many people might have overlooked, those in the crowd, that is. But they were singled out by the Lord for a specific purpose that he had in mind. In Luke chapter 19, the first 9 verses, we have the story of Zacchaeus. Now, I can't say the word Zacchaeus without thinking about the song that we all learned in Sunday school. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. It is a song that helps a young person remember the events of the story. And yet there's so much more than just the song. But we know that as we read quickly through the first 9 verses, then Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Already had 2 marks against him. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. So he ran ahead and climbed up into the sycamore tree to see him. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to Zacchaeus, "Make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house." So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. But when they saw it, that is the crowd, they all murmured, saying, "He has gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner." Remember, he was rich and he was a tax collector. Then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore 4-fold." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. If anyone would truly want to be lost in a crowd, it was Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, being a Jewish tax collector, was despised and scorned by the Jewish people. Now, the Jews were under the Roman rule, and the Romans required tribute, or what we would call taxes. And they needed someone to collect those taxes for them. And so they would actually choose Jews who were willing to come out and to collect those taxes from their own people. In return, the tax collectors could charge additional taxes to cover their expenses and to make a tidy profit for them. With the Jews believing that the taxes in Rome were already too high and having to pay even more to cover the salary and wealth of the tax collector, this infuriated them all the more. They saw the tax collectors as Jewish traitors. And when these collectors were seen in public, they were often scorned, ridiculed, and bad things said to them. Sometimes even things hurled to them like vegetables and stuff to show the Jewish people's disdain for tax collectors. So when you go out in public, you kind of want it to hide in the crowd. But in this case, Zacchaeus had heard about Jesus. And he was compelled to go and to see Jesus, to see what was going on. But being a wee little man, he could not see over the crowd. But that didn't stop him. So he climbed up into a sycamore tree to be able to look down over the people and to see Jesus when he was coming. Amazing. Once he put himself in that tree, not only would the Lord see him, but the crowd would see him. But he was willing to take that risk. However, Zacchaeus was a good man. Remember, it was the Lord who said, immediately, make haste, Zacchaeus, come down, because I'm going to go home with you. How scandalous was that? How could this man of God, this good prophet, associate himself with a sinner, a traitor of our own kind? This man is not worthy for you to go home. To go home and eat with him was to honor him. This man should not be honored. But Zacchaeus was a good man who would right any wrong that he had done in overcharging anyone. If he did overcharge someone, he would pay them back, not once, twice, but 4 times. Who does that? Has the IRS ever overcharged you? And when they catch that mistake, do they give you 4-fold? And he gave half of his profits to the poor. Half. Who does that? Does anyone here? I know I don't. He was a good man, but his fellow Jews did not see it that way. They prejudged him for the occupation that he had, and since he was wealthy, they assumed he must be greedy and he must be devious to have received that wealth. Again, think how scandalous this was for Jesus to say, come on down, Zacchaeus. I'm going to go home with you. But Jesus called Zacchaeus from the crowd for a purpose. One was that Zacchaeus was seeking. He was seeking Jesus. And Jesus had just told the people on what we call the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, seek and you will find. This was the manifestation of the very principle that Jesus had taught the people in that sermon. Secondly, Jesus was demonstrating not to judge a book by its cover. Again, another principle that he talked about during his Sermon on the Mount, which was in Matthew 7, verse 1. Judge not unless you want to be judged. The prejudice of the Jews kept them from seeing the good that Zacchaeus had done. And I would ask, how often do we prejudge someone else just because of the way they dress, the place they come from, their social economic standing, their educational standing, or even their occupation, like Zacchaeus. And thirdly, Jesus said that as the great physician, that he came for the sick, not the healthy. The people called Zacchaeus a sinner. Jesus came to call the sinners to repentance in Mark 2, verse 17, when he said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Again, Jesus demonstrated, if you think he's a sinner, that's the very person that I came for, not for the righteous. It was because of man's sin that Jesus had to come to earth as a man himself. He came to provide sinners a means to stand justified before God. So Jesus called Zacchaeus to come out from the crowd to demonstrate the principles that he had already taught the people. His very action of what he was doing gave life to the words which he had previously spoken to them. Zacchaeus was called out for a purpose. Seek, and ye shall find. The other person called out in the crowd was a woman in need of healing. In Mark chapter 5, verses 24 through 34, and I have some of the verses written here, we find a lady who is called in the Old King James Version, as I would call it, an issuance of blood. She was hemorrhaging, and she had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. For 12 years she had this ailment, and she went to the doctors of the day asking for help, to the point that she had spent all of her wealth on seeing them. And she had gotten even worse. She was a desperate person. Because of the issuance of blood, she was considered unclean by the Jews and would have stayed at home away from everyone and not exposed herself to them. But in these verses, we find that she went out in the crowd to find Jesus because she believed from what she had heard that if I just touch his garments, I can be healed. And so she went out into a crowd that she knew would despise her, that would shun her, that would spit upon her, that would push her away if they dared to get that close. But yet, she was so desperate, she was willing to get up and to go out. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm sick, I'm really sick, I don't want to go out in public. I want to stay home and rest and be away from everyone and get well. She had tried that, but it hadn't worked. But she heard about Jesus and what he was willing to do. And in that desperation, she went out. How difficult it must have been for her to push through that crowd, to be called unclean. But yet, now in one less desperate act, she pushed through the crowd. She touched the garments of Jesus, and immediately she was healed. She was healed. Jesus would ask, "Who touched me?" And the apostles around him said, "What do you mean, who touched you? You're totally surrounded by people. They're all over you. And you ask who touched you?" But he had a reason for asking. And he looked out and he picked the woman out of the crowd because he knew the power within him had gone out and healed that woman. But he pulled her out among the crowd, out from the crowd, and made her the focus of attention and told her, "Your faith has healed you." Think about it. This lady had to press her way through the crowd, and yet as she was doing so, she had the faith in her that if she could but touch those garments, she would be healed. And yet she was. Just like Zacchaeus, this woman was seeking the Lord. And she found him. But in addition, she had an ask. And that ask was to heal her. And another principle that Jesus had just talked about was fulfilled. Not only seek and you shall find, ask and it shall be given to you. In Mark chapter 2, we read of the story of Jesus being in a house, and the people again have flocked to him. There's a huge crowd. And yet there are people there who are wanting to be healed, and there is a lame man, of course, who could not walk, that his friends brought him to see Jesus. And in Mark chapter 2, verse 4, it says, since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. And we know the rest of the story. Jesus attended to this lame person and wound up healing him. But there's so much here. First of all, and let me pause and say, the four friends this man had, those are the friends I want. They had a friend that was in need. They sought an opportunity to fulfill that need, and they wouldn't let anything stand in their way to get that need fulfilled for their one friend. They got onto the roof when they could not get through the crowd, and they tore up the roof of the man's house. Now, I don't know about you, but if someone tore up my roof to get into it, I'd be a little upset. We're not told much about it, and Jesus doesn't ridicule them for tearing up the roof. Hopefully they put it back together when they got done. But you have this hole made in the roof, and the man lowered down with what they had, and Jesus looks, stops from what he's saying, and he just says, your sins are forgiven. Whoa, that's not the ask that the lame man had. But the Lord said, your sins are forgiven. The crowd then gasped, only God can forgive sins. Who is this person thinking that he can do this? Now, these were the people who were excited to see Jesus. But Jesus, you've overstepped your boundaries. And then he simply says, which do you think is easier? To forgive sins or to heal this man and let him walk? But to show you that I am the Son of God, take up your bed and walk. And that's what the lame man did. That was his ask. But he got something far greater. Sometimes we're lost in a crowd looking for something in particular that we think we need. But then Jesus pulls us out of the crowd and gives us something entirely different. Something we need more. Amazing that these men were willing to do whatever it took to get to Jesus. As his disciples, we should be willing to do whatever it takes to be a part of his family. Back in 91, I was transferred up to Canada for 3 months during a development stage of my career, and I ran a small plant up there during this time. I was gone from my family for 3 months. I got to come home every third weekend and see Denise and the kids, and it was hard. It was difficult being away. But the first thing I did when I got to Toronto was look for the church. Now, Toronto at that time was 2/3 of the population of Georgia, just Toronto itself. And of all of those 3.8 million people, I found one congregation of the Lord's church of about 70 people. When I attended, I was amazed. You know, sometimes we Americanize a few things. They did everything according to the Scriptures. It was just a little different in the order and such. The Lord's Supper, probably they spent 15 minutes talking about it, and the sermon was no more than 12 to 15 minutes. A little different. But the people were from different parts of the world. South Africa, Nigeria, England. There was one young lady that was there who told me her story. When she was 16, she went to a gospel meeting in London, and she obeyed the gospel. And when she came home, she told her father, I've become a Christian. And immediately and literally, her father kicked her out of the house and would never let her come back in again. At 16, she was on her own with nothing. Somehow she is able to scrape together and make somewhat of a living and got a ticket to fly over to Canada. And that's how she landed in Toronto. She had a job, a lady of modest means, but she was so happy to be able to worship with the people in Toronto. She went through much to be able to hold on to her faith. She would not give it up. And I couldn't help but think about these friends who took this lame man and did so much for him. She did not have those friends, but in herself she knew that she had the Lord. And she did everything within her power that where many of us would have given up, she was not going to give up the Lord. She truly made a bold step to put her family, her Lord before her family's rejection. It doesn't take much to be used in the eyes of the Lord. In John chapter 6, we have the story of where you have the multitude of people there before the Lord, and they're hungry. There are 5,000 men alone. We don't know how many women or children. And the Lord asked his disciples, do we have enough to feed these people? Which they thought, you've got to be crazy. Andrew says, there's no way. If we had all this money, there's no way we could feed these people. But what do we have? They took a young lad, and he had 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. A young lad. And they pulled him out and presented him before the Lord. They said, he has this, but what is this among so many? Interestingly, that was a lot for one boy to have. 5 loaves? I don't know what size they were, but there were 5 of them. And the 2 fish, if you read about it, a lot of scholars speculate that the fish were more probably like the size of sardines. Now, barley is dry bread. You take a bite of it, it's kind of hard to wash it down. And you'd take that sardine-like fish and you'd spread it across the bread to kind of improve the taste, but also to help it go down a little bit easier. We know the results of this story. They took those 2 fish and 5 loaves and fed everybody, and then picked up the scraps, and there were 12 baskets left. Truly a miracle had been performed, but it was Jesus who chose a lad. Who knew that that lad would be known throughout time? As we read the scriptures of the important role that he played in Jesus showing that he would provide for the people. It is amazing. We will never know which little person God will use, and it may be us. So often we say, well, we're just not good enough. Well, Moses, he was a great man, and even he said he wasn't good enough to go in and to deliver the people from Egypt. And if he wasn't good enough, then surely I'm not. Jesus chose a lad who had nothing but bread and some fish. Turned it into a miraculous event that we're able to talk about today. The Lord knows us all. He knows who we are. He knows what we have and how we can be used for him. He is the divine author over each and every moment. He is literally writing our stories. And he can do eternally amazing things with the little fragments of our lives that we're carrying around and that we tend to think aren't worth very much. And the last story we talk about is in John chapter 8, the only place that it's found. It's not in the other Gospels. And it's the story of the woman caught in adultery and brought before Jesus in the first 11 verses of John chapter 8. Of all the stories that are recorded in the New Testament, this one is the most endearing to me. It strikes home the most. There's not much said here, but when you look into it, you see so much. Again, we know the story. Jesus is there, and some people have become jealous that he's become the center of attention. There are religious people who have become jealous. They see him as a threat to their religious power. And so they're always trying to scheme and find a way to trick Jesus, to catch him in something, to make disfavor in the eyes of others. And in this story, they bring a woman that they say is caught in adultery. Now you need to understand something. Adultery, that was one of the deadly sins. Under Jewish law, you were stoned. Same as murder. Amazing for this act. And this woman had been brought out. Think about how frightened she was. They said she was caught in the very act of it, and people will say, well, what happened to the guy? Well, some people say he could have been in that crowd. He could have, but have you ever thought they already stoned him? They had already killed him? And she had witnessed that? I don't know. We're not told. But we have this frightened woman, a woman who has no authority. She has been dragged through the streets, her clothes probably torn, her skin bruised and scratched, and she's thrown before the Lord and said, Jesus, you're a righteous man. This woman's been caught guilty of adultery. What do we do with her? And we know it was a trick. If he said, let her go, they would say, then you're denying the law of Moses. How can we let this guilty person go? And if he said, fulfill the law of Moses, stone her, they would have said, but aren't you the one that talks about forgiveness? Either way, they thought they had a way to do it. But Jesus could not be tricked. And we know what he did. He went down. He wrote on the ground. And he simply said, let the person who has no sin throw that first rock. Well, to do that would admit that they were perfect, and they couldn't do that. And Jesus went back and writing again. And the scriptures tell us that they all left from the oldest to the youngest. There's something about a mob mentality. When you get caught up in a mob, you lose your personality and you adopt the personality of the mob. Think about the Western days. How they'd bring someone into town and they would have a lynching, and the mob would get out there and cry for that person to be hung for whatever they did without a trial. You had, so to speak, God-fearing people in that mob saying, hang him, hang him. Because they put away their own personality. They pulled away from themselves and they adopted the identity of the mob. And many of them would regret it afterwards. We have to be very careful not to be caught up in the crowd. This woman was pulled out of a crowd for Jesus to demonstrate to us, do not be part of the crowd and go along with what they want. They will consume you. They will take you down. I will pull you out. I couldn't imagine how frightened this lady was, because she knew life was over with. She knew it. But as they walked away from the oldest to the youngest, Jesus says, where are your accusers? And she said, there are none. Could this be? But I'm still before this great prophet. And Jesus says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Remember, the great physician had come not for the righteous, but for the sinner. And in doing what he did here, he proved that very thing. Go and sin no more. He came to provide a way that we as sinners could be reunited with God the Father. And the people that he chose in the stories that we talked about this morning prove just that point. If you're lost in a crowd, you need to do what Zacchaeus did. Do what you can do to find him, and he will do what he can do to find you and to remove you from the crowd and go home with you so that you may live eternally with him and the Father in heaven. If you're in that crowd and you need to get out, if you've been out of that crowd but you went back in it and need to come out, why not come to Jesus? Hark the gentle voice, but together we stand and sing.